Hi, this is Woodwork Designs by Z, and today I'm going to be building the ultimate crosscut sled. Keep watching to see what happens. This is my old crosscut sled. I built it back when I first got my table saw, and as you can see, it's not very good. It had a sloppy wooden runner, and the hold downs do not slide very well in the T-slots. I think it's time for an upgrade. I start off by ripping down some pieces of 3/4 inch maple veneer plywood to use for the back fence. I'll need 2 of these to make the thickness of the back fence. The back fence is the fence that you hold the pieces of wood up against when cutting them with this crosscut sled. Like I already said, I ripped 2 pieces to make the thickness I need. I do make sure to save the offcuts because I can use those for the front fence later. After that, I move on to the glue up. I apply a liberal amount of glue. If anyone's wondering, I'm using Type-On 3. And then I spread it around with one of these Rockler glue brushes. I like these Rockler glue brushes because it keeps me from getting glue all over my fingers. It's not perfect, and I do still get some glue on my fingers, but it's better than nothing. After that, I apply a bunch of clamps. I try to make sure the panels stay as flush as possible on the edges. They don't have to be perfect because I will clean up the edges afterward, but as close as possible is good. After that, I start working on the base of the crosscut sled. I rip one side of this piece of ambrosia maple plywood. It was left over from some project a while ago. After that, I move the fence over to its final width and I flip it around and rip the other side. This will end up leaving me with 2 perfectly parallel, cleaned up edges. Then I'll cross-cut it to its final length. After that, I take it over to the router table and I use a 3/8 inch upcut spiral router bit to cut 2 grooves in the panel. I do this so that I can add T-slots like the last sled. I'll make sure to sand these though so the hold downs actually slide in them. I tried to use the push paddle to push it through the router table, but it just wasn't grippy enough, so I resorted to my hands. Don't worry, I made sure to keep my hands far away from the spinning router bit. After those grooves were cut, I used this router bit from Rockler. It cuts T-slots into those grooves I previously cut. I like this router bit over using T-track because I think it's better. You don't have to pay for it more than once, and it's plenty strong enough. I add the T-slots to the grooves. So it's not that hard. It's much easier to push it through the router table this time because most of the material has been cleared out with a 3/8 inch bit. After that, the clamps come off the back fence. Then that gets cleaned up over at the table saw. Don't forget to use my push stick. I rip one side. This is why I wanted it to be as close as possible, so I could just reference it off the fence without having to take it over to the joiner. Then I rip the other side and make sure it's at its final width. Don't worry, the glue is dry enough so it doesn't trip my saw stop. And then the fence gets a groove cut in it over at the router table. This will be for a T-slot like before, so that eventually I can use a stop block. After cutting the groove, I move on to cutting the slot with the slot cutting router bit. Then I take the fence back over to the table saw and I cut a rabbet bit in it. I don't have a dado stack, so I use the regular blade and I first cut the piece standing up on end. Then I cut it laying down on its face. This rabbet will be so that way I can attach it to the bottom with a very secure joint. After that, I glue up the front fence. This is glued up just like the other one. I squirt the glue on, I spread it around with the glue brush, and then I put the 2 pieces together. I apply all the clamps. This time I decided to use a bunch of spring clamps and C-clamps. And a couple trigger clamps. Again, I try to make sure these panels are as flush as possible. Like I said earlier, it'll make it easier when I take it over to the table saw. I think I may have applied too many clamps to this panel. You know what? Never mind. You can never have too many clamps. After that, while that is drying, I take the bottom panel over to the drill press and I drilled a couple of holes. I don't drill all the ones I need to attach the back fence, just enough because I still have to square up the fence after with the 5-cut method. And if I drill too many holes, then when I do the 5-cut method, that'll make it much harder. I then attach the back fence. It's intentional that it's still long. I figured I'd get it attached and then get the miter bar installed so that way, I could mark it exactly where I need to cut the fence before cutting it to its final length. If anyone's wondering what miter bar I plan to use, I'll leave a link in the video description to it. I use a couple of washers to space the miter bar up from the slot in the table saw. This is so it can actually come in contact with the panel. I apply double-sided tape and struggle to remove the sticky backing off of it. After that, I stick the crosscut sled down, making sure it's square before carefully removing it from the slot. Then, I go get my impact driver and add all the screws into the miter bar. I then mark where I need to cut the fence. And then everything comes back apart. In hindsight, I really should have just cut the fence before screwing it on. I used the stock miter gauge that came with the saw to cut this fence. I could use my old crosscut sled, but like I said before, it had a bunch of slop in the wooden runner. I then reattach the fence again. After that, the clamps come off the front fence. Then that gets cleaned up the exact same way over at the table saw. Rip one side and then rip the other side to get it to its final length, or width. After that, I spend a lot of time with a tape measure, a square, and I mark out exactly how I want to cut it. This shape is just because the fence doesn't have to be as big as the back fence. This fence's purpose is only to keep the two halves of the crosscut sled from spreading apart when I cut through it. After that, I take the fence to the bandsaw and I cut out the rough shape. I stay just outside my line because I can clean it up with sanding after. I want to get it close to the line though because as little sanding as I can do as possible is great. Everyone loves sanding. After that, like I said, I sand. I should use my belt sander, but the belt needed to be replaced, so I just used my random orbital sander. There wasn't that many bandsaw marks to remove, and it didn't take that long. If you're enjoying the content so far, please consider subscribing and maybe giving this video a thumbs up, and maybe leaving a comment. After that, I took and I used the front fence on the crosscut sled that I already had made, and I marked out where I need to cut it to its length and drill the holes to attach the fence. I just used my square and my pencil and my tape measure to figure this out. I had to find center of the fence so that I could drill out those holes. This will just be attached with T-bolts in the T-slots. I then took it over to the drill press and I drilled out the holes in the fence. I had to drill out both sides, so after doing one, I turned it around and did the other side. Then I took it over to the table saw, and again using the stock miter gauge, I cut it to its final length. I had to cut both sides because I wanted that part in the middle to be in the middle of the crosscut sled. I couldn't lay it down flat and still see my line on this side, so I stood it up, I cut it, and then I lay it down flat and lined it up with the groove of my crosscut sled. Cut it. After that, I took everything apart and gave it a nice chamfer over at the router table. I gave the bottom a chamfer, but only on the sides, and make sure to stop short. Then I give everything a sanding. I hate sanding. Doesn't everyone, but the sanding will make it much nicer than my other crosscut sled, and that's kind of what I'm going for here. After that, I used the T-bolts from my old crosscut sled, and I install it the same way the other one on my old crosscut sled was installed. Just fits in the T-slot. Then I used these knobs, which I made for my old crosscut sled, and was just too lazy to make new ones. This crosscut sled design is based off of one I saw on YouTube by Drew Fisher, if anyone's wondering. I'll be sure to have links to that video in the description as well. Then I gave everything a sanding, well, only the T-slots, so that all the bolts would slide smoothly. Like I already said, I hate sanding. Then I went through and adjusted the miter bar to make sure that it fit perfect in the miter slot. This was a little finicky, but I got it in the end. I just had to go through and tighten and loosen all the nylon bolts to make sure they were sticking out the appropriate amount. I'm only showing part of the process here because if I showed you the whole process, this video would be much longer. But eventually I got it, and it fits in the miter slot perfectly. After that, I made the first cut through the middle of the crosscut sled. It's kind of sad cutting through something I worked so hard on, but it's what it's meant to do, so it didn't feel that bad. Then I cut this piece of MDF. This is so that I could do the 5-cut method. It consists of cutting one side, then marking it, and placing that side up against the fence, then cutting the next side, and marking it, and then putting that side up against the fence, and cutting the next side, and marking that, then putting that side up against the fence, and cutting the 4th side. This will multiply whatever errors in the fence by 4. Then you flip it around to side number 1 again, and you cut it off a piece. Then you can measure that with calipers and do a bunch of math to correct for the error. I won't show you the rest of that process because it was kind of hard, but in the end, I got it square. After that, I used an offcut from my back fence, or front fence in this case, to create a safety block. If you don't understand what that is, then just keep watching. I drew a circle on it with a random bucket I had, then cut that out over at the bandsaw. After that, I sanded it again. Why does this project have so much sanding? It's just a shop project. Then I used some wood glue to attach the block. I only put a little bit on here. Then I used my finger to spread it around because the glue brush was inside. I had washed it off in the sink after using it last time and forgot to bring it back out to the garage. Then I used some of this Starbond medium thickness CA glue. So I put that in the middle, and then I spray some of the accelerator spray on the actual crosscut sled. This allows me to glue the block on and not have to wait for glue to dry. It acts kind of like a clamp. This block will protect my fingers when the blade exits the back of the sled. And here's the finished results. I think it came out kind of nice. It was a fun, simple project, and it didn't take that long to complete, and it really is much better. Thanks for watching.